Good evening, I'm Jim Zirin. This is The Digital Age. Our subject tonight is the national security of the United States and what are our gravest challenges. Some might say it's the implosion in Japan, unrest in the Middle East, or perhaps the surging price of oil. Others would argue it's Iran, North Korea, China, Al-Qaeda. No shortage of challenges. Joining us tonight is Richard Haass. Richard Haass is the president of the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations. He is a former senior official of the State Department, and he is the author of 11 books on the foreign policy of the United States. Richard, welcome to this assessment as we go around the world. We're delighted to have you back with us.
Good to be here.
Now, why don't we start with Japan, which seems to be the most urgent topic in the news. What do you see is going on there?
Well, you obviously have the terrible devastation, human life, the physical plant, if you will, of Japan. We don't know how long it's going to be, to some extent, out of action in terms of people not being able to work, not being able to go back to their homes. I think getting beyond the humanitarian, the real question is, what does this mean for Japan and the world? And I think it has some very interesting consequences. Japan is the world's second or third largest economy. This is obviously going to slow it down. A tremendous amount of wealth has been obliterated in Japan. It's going to slow economic growth in the region and the world. First you had this recovery, and then you had the Eurozone problems, and then the higher energy prices. Now this, it's going to add to the sense of speed bumps that are getting in the way of world economic recovery. It's going to reinforce the sense that Japan, despite its wealth, is an underperformer in the world. For 2 decades now, Japan has been hamstrung by a lack of economic growth, and this is going to reinforce the sense of a Japan that's looking inward, that's not able to play a large regional or global role. And I think it's also going to have real consequences for the energy situation. It's going to make it harder to move ahead with nuclear. At the same time, as we know, that we wanted to move ahead with nuclear, both to reduce the dependence on oil, foreign and otherwise, but also because of climate change. What's so good about nuclear is it doesn't contribute to a carbon footprint. And I think that some of the directions we were beginning to see the debates move in the United States and around the world over nuclear power, that's probably going to be at best put on pause.
I think you said before the earthquake that Japan was a country that couldn't get a break. And we're seeing it now in spades with what's happened at the Fukushima reactors and what the consequences are going to be. I mean, Germany, I think Merkel announced today that they're putting their nuclear program on hold for 6 months. You think that's going to happen to the United States?
Well, it's already happened to some extent. The United States has not had a new reactor, in 25 or so years be commissioned. We face a real challenge in this country. At the Council on Foreign Relations, we did a study of the American nuclear power industry, and we've got just over 100 reactors that are up and running. The problem is almost all of those are meant to be retired somewhere over the next 30 to 50 years. That means we've got to start replacing them at a rate of about 2 a year just to stand in place. I don't see how we're going to do that. I was somewhat doubtful before this happened. I'm really doubtful now.
Well, our thoughts and prayers are with the Japanese people. Let's move on to Bahrain, which is another country in the news these days. 1,000 Saudi troops went into Bahrain. They say it's not an invasion, but it's certainly an incursion. Iran has said it's unacceptable. How do you see that as playing out?
Well, I don't see it as either an invasion or incursion. It's invited in by the government. Essentially, the Saudis and other Sunni monarchs around that part of the world want to draw the line. They do not want to see the Bahrainis overthrown. They worry about Shia primacy in Bahrain. They worry about inroads for Iranian influence. And what you're seeing is, at the invitation, presumably, of the Bahraini government, you're seeing the Saudis and others, I think the UAE, send in troops to essentially buttress the capacities of the government there to put down the popular resistance. To me, one question is, though, whether this necessarily makes things better. It certainly doesn't add to the legitimacy of a Bahraini government. And the real question is, what kind of reforms are you going to see? And whether this is now the worst of all contexts to introduce reform. Once people are in the streets, once violence is happening, reforms tend not to put out fires. So I think Bahrain is very much in play. in ways that quite honestly are worrisome, because if Bahrain were to become the locus of tremendous instability, that really would roil Saudi Arabia, and that really then would have tremendous consequences for world oil markets.
So, and there's also the potential for regional conflict between Saudi and Iran.
I doubt you'd see traditional conflict, but you're more likely to see elements of proxy, clandestine sorts of work, subversion. Indeed, I expect you're already seeing some of that.
Yes. Now, there's an irony, isn't there, that the Iranians crush dissidents in their own country, and yet they encourage protests in Bahrain.
Irony is one word for it. The Middle East, shall we say, is replete with double standards, and where those aren't good enough, you've probably got some triple standards. But you're exactly right. The Iranians have so far been remarkably intolerant. If anything, the Iranian regime is going through something of a Thermidorian phase. They're beginning to oust people who for a while were on the vanguard of revolution, and even that's not good enough. So you see the extreme hardliners, if you will, the ideologues around Rafsanjani and others gain ever more power. It's possible that in the long run this will be unsustainable, and we may look back on this period as something like the beginning of the end of this phase of the Iranian revolution, some 30 years after Khomeini toppled the Shah. But at least in the near term, Iran is likely to get more, not less, difficult. They were already the great strategic gainer, if you will, from the Iraq War, with the removal of Saddam Hussein, the removal of Iraq as something of a counterbalance. We've seen the Iranians increase their sway in Gaza. We've seen it in Lebanon. We've seen it in Syria. And we may be seeing it in parts elsewhere now, in places like Bahrain. There's clearly a bid, if not for regional hegemony, for regional influence. Iran is something of an imperial power in the Middle East, and they want to do what imperial powers want to do, which is have influence everywhere. Particularly
in a country where the majority are Shias, such as like the Iranians.
Well, exactly,
which is Bahrain, and it's almost a kind of irredentism, isn't it?
You've got that connection as well, but they also love it, even if that weren't the case, simply to point the stick at the Saudis. It also says something about our policy. The United States has been tougher on Mubarak than it ever was on Iran. Same goes for Syria. Why are we giving the most closed societies in the region, in particular Iran and Syria, a relative pass? And we're calling for restraint in Bahrain. I think the United States needs to ratchet up its policy, in particular towards Iran, put them on the defensive a bit, see what we can do to perhaps promote domestic internal change in a country like Iran. At the same time, we continue to encourage evolutionary change in the countries we're closer to. And I would just say one other thing: we ought to keep our eye on Egypt. The two most important countries from the American point of view are Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Saudi because its position in the Gulf, obviously its centrality for world oil production.
It's the oil jackpot.
Exactly. It's also at the center of the Islamic world, given Mecca and Medina. And Egypt. Egypt's a quarter of the Arab world. You're talking 85 million people. Cairo is the great city of the Arab world. And we ought not to take our eye off that bubble. Far more important than anything that goes on in Libya, far more important than anything that really goes on anywhere else in the Middle East right now, is what happens in Egypt. And I worry that the pace of political change there, in a funny sort of way, is going too fast. The timetables that have been laid out for constitutional and political change, the elections and so forth, are so compressed that you're not giving civil society a chance to develop. The Islamic Brotherhood's in a better position than other political parties to gain a degree of power there. So I worry that while we're so focused for various reasons, whether it's on Bahrain or more recently Libya, I worry that we're not giving Egypt the attention it deserves.
Certainly it's hard to see democracy without a strong civil society and without a strong middle class, and you may not have that in Egypt or even elsewhere in the Arab world.
The answer is you can't see democracy without exactly those things: civil society, middle class. You need checks and balances, not simply within a government like our Constitution provides, but you need checks and balances between a government and the society. You need independent sources of power and wealth that can push back on a government. And in Egypt, you simply don't see enough of that. So I worry about jamming through a constitution, elections, and the like. I personally would rather see things go slower. I'd also see greater emphasis put on helping the Egyptian economy, which could be the Achilles heel of any new government.
Well, any new government will have to deal with the same issues that confronted Mubarak, which are lack of jobs, even lack of jobs for educated, college-educated people, and also the high price of food, which is
absolutely
bedeviling the country. Now, there's some grounds for optimism in Egypt. I mean, we saw the army arresting the people responsible for the camel attacks in the square, and we see the army, the Muslim Brotherhood said they're not going to run in the next election. I don't know whether that's true or not.
Well, they're not going to mount a presidential candidate yet.
Of course, you only have two organized political parties. You had Mubarak's party and you have the Muslim Brotherhood. So how do you get parties and fundraising and an organization in place for an early election?
And the answer is you can't. You really can't get them up to speed. Again, it's the reason that speed can sometimes be the enemy of real democratization. You don't want to end up with electocracy. You want something that's much more firmly rooted. So I worry a little bit there. I think you're right. The fact that things went as peaceful, relatively, as they've gone in Egypt for the most part. The army did nothing to undermine its legitimacy as an institution. So you're beginning to see some points or elements of progress, but the lack of broad political participation has to be worrying. Look, we're still in early days here in Egypt. You know, I've used metaphors like second inning and things like that. We are early on, and it could, for all we know, we're going to see multiple governments, multiple sets of elections before we know what is the character or personality of the political system in Egypt. My only concern is that I want the United States to stay as involved as it can in the process economically and politically. We don't want to become a source of nationalist reaction or resentment, but I do think we need to stay involved.
Well, I mean, the worst thing for us would be democracy followed by autocratic rule again, except perhaps autocratic rule imposed by religious extremists or radicals.
Exactly, and that's why rarely in a revolution is the first successor to the ancien regime what lasts. And that's why I think this has several rounds to play out. So I'm not worried about the Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood taking over tomorrow. But it is possible in several years, if you have a combination of failed governments and an economy that doesn't improve, I could see that type of a process happening. And again, it's the lack of checks and balances throughout the society that worries me.
Let's contrast what happened in Tunisia, where the president left the country before there was any real confrontation. Egypt, where Mubarak resigned and the army refused to turn its guns on the Egyptian people. And Libya, perhaps pushed off the front page a little bit by the events in Japan. But in Libya, Gaddafi decided to crack down on his own people, and you're witnessing there what appears to be a civil war. How do you suppose that's going to play out?
Well, I think you're right in contrasting the three. In Tunisia, you had a government that lost its nerve and folded, and a military that essentially fell apart. In Egypt, the government kept its nerve for quite a while, but the military would not compromise or risk its own legitimacy in killing the Egyptian people to save Mubarak and his son's ability to succeed him. So ultimately, if a regime isn't willing to use force to stay in power, it will fade. What you have in Libya is just that. You've got a regime that's staying sufficiently intact and is willing to use force against the opposition, and for the time being, it's prevailing. Now, as you know, I've argued against various forms of American or outside military intervention.
Notably the no-fly zone.
Yeah, I think that's a symbolic act that would have limited military consequences. The aircraft are not central to what Gaddafi's doing. We would then be on the hook to do a lot more. I'm unpersuaded it's worth it, given U.S. interests. I'm also unpersuaded that the people we would be helping are necessarily people we know we want to help. I don't believe we know enough about the tribal alternatives to Gaddafi to be confident that the people we would be, say, sending arms to or doing greater military action on behalf of would necessarily be the sort of people we would want to support. We've learned that in other...
notably Afghanistan.
Notably Afghanistan, plus we've got our hands full still with Iraq and Afghanistan. So I simply don't see why the United States would want to get involved here. We want to help you in a humanitarian way. And we have longer term options. If we decide over time that we want to weaken Gaddafi, we can keep sanctions in place. We can do things to strengthen the opposition, hopefully to shape the opposition, so maybe we would have more confidence in it. But a civil war is, to me, the worst of all possible moments for the United States to try to play a decisive role.
we can't just have a no-fly zone and declare a no-fly zone. We would have to bomb the anti-aircraft emplacements. Secretary Gates says we would all probably have to bomb airfields and crater them. So,
but even that wouldn't be enough. In order to create a no-fly zone, you're right, you'd have to take out air defense. But even a perfect no-fly zone would have minimal effect. So then you'd have to say, what next? Would you go after every tank, every helicopter? Even that might not be enough. You're going to put advisors on the ground. At some point, you're going to have to take physical ownership then of the country. Do we really want to do that? What would that entail? And then again, how do we get out with any confidence that we would be able to put into place or see put into place a political alternative that would be demonstrably better? I'm surprised that so many of the advocates of military action seem to be thinking it only one step at a time, talking about moral necessities and so forth. They're not thinking it through 2, 3, 4 steps down the road. So actually, where the president is getting a lot of criticism for his restraint here, I actually think, for the most part, the administration is right to want to hold back from jumping in with 1, much less 2 feet in Libya.
Now, changing the subject a little bit, Director of National Intelligence Clapper, remember, testified before the Senate that China and Russia pose our greatest mortal threats. And he was criticized for that statement. Do you agree with what he said, and should he be fired for making such stupid statements?
Well, clearly you don't agree with what he said. No, I don't agree with what he said. I thought it was quite honestly ridiculous. Just because countries have certain capabilities, in this case nuclear weapons, doesn't mean they're mortal threats to the United States. China isn't, I don't believe. Russia is. Other countries have nuclear weapons. They are Britain, France, Israel. They're not mortal threats to the United States. So it's preposterous to base intelligence simply on capabilities. You've got to look at intentions, orientation, and so forth. It also seemed to me just years and years wrong in terms of being overtaken by events. I've got a lot of concerns about the world, but Russia and China are not among them. I worry about the situation on the Korean Peninsula, which over the next couple of years could well be the most dangerous place in the world. I worry about Iran and its nuclear ambitions. I worry about Pakistan and the potential for Pakistan to be something of a failed state. I worry about globally this gap that we see between this rash of global challenges and the arrangements that are in place. In virtually every area of international life, there's a shortfall between what we need in place and what we have in place. And this is true in the economic realm, it's true when it comes to energy and climate change, it's true when it comes to proliferation or terrorism. Those are the real threats. The threats, external threats of the 21st century are not 20th century threats of great powers. That really is old thing. 21st century threats are global threats when you think about what's out there externally. The other half of it, at the risk of getting ahead of ourselves, is our capacity to contend with these threats.
Yes, well, Admiral Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, thought it was budgetary deficits and our incapacity to deal with the external threats. I mean, what do you see as the external threat? Are there any things you've talked about, or are we our own worst enemy, in effect?
In effect, look, we've been talking about a whole range of external challenges to the United States. If I'm right, the most telling are the global ones. Again, I'm not worried about hostile great powers. That really is a 20th century template for a 21st century world. I'm more worried about weak states like Pakistan than I am about strong states. But I think the Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, is exactly right. The biggest challenge to world order, if you will, is not so much anything out there, it's in here. And it is the continued ability of the United States to be an effective leader in the world. Because if we can't lead, no one else is. There's no one else, if you will, in the on-deck circle. We are going to have to do it. And there's real questions about our political capacity to put our own house in order, whether you're dealing with the fiscal deficit and the accumulated debt, or whether you're talking about dealing with our K through 12 education problem, which gets to the heart of our competitiveness, or our immigration policy, or our aging or ailing infrastructure. You go through it issue by issue by issue. A serious energy policy, which we still don't have 40 years after the first oil shocks. So I think the chairman is exactly right. It's the internal challenge. And that's what we really need to turn to. And what worries me so much is if you look at the most recent budget submitted by the administration and you look at the political reaction to it, I don't see people yet on either side of the aisle prepared to talk in serious ways about what it will really entail to get our fiscal house in order. It obviously has to deal with things like entitlements. You're not going to do it by simply focusing on the 11 or 12% of the budget that deals with discretionary domestic spending. Plus, the last thing you want to do is cut out some of your real investment. You're going to have to, defense is going to have to take a piece of it, something of a hit. But it's like Willie Sutton. You rob banks because that's where the money is. If you want to get serious about America's budget challenge, you've got to tackle entitlements because that's where the money is. And that means Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the like. And so far, at least, I don't see a serious conversation about that.
Well, in a country like China, there'd be no problem with something like this because the leadership would identify the problem and do something about it, and there'd be no dissent, certainly no public dissent.
With one exception, because China right now has an inflation problem. And the leadership is a little bit worried about doing what it needs to do because they're worried if they slow economic growth, the lubricant, if you will, of that society, which is rising living standards, could be threatened. The Chinese know that their stability depends more than anything now, not on communism or anything like that, but on economic performance. So the leadership in China is actually worried about doing some things they probably should do in the long run to cool their economy. I think they're worried about the short and medium run consequences. So even in a still authoritarian or quasi-authoritarian system like China, there's limits to what they are willing to do. Though again, I take your basic point. They obviously have less constraints than we do, given the nature of
no Tea Party.
No Tea Party. And basically, you don't have distributed political power in any comparable way in China to what you have in the United States.
Well, one thing they might try to do something about is their fractious and abrasive relationship with the United States. Now, we had a summit meeting in January. What came out of that? Anything?
Not much. Look, it used to be that economic relations were kind of the foundation or the ballast for U.S.-China relations, even when we might disagree on Taiwan or something else. But now economic relations have become a pretty basic source of the tension, whether it's over China's currency, which is artificially manipulated, the trade imbalance, or what have you. So you've lost that foundation to U.S.-China relations. You've also lost the strategic rationale once the Cold War ended. We no longer have a Soviet Union as a joint adversary. So the United States and China are trying to figure out what is it they're for? What is this relationship about now in this new era? Ultimately, I would suggest it has to be about dealing with global challenges that affect us both, whether it's North Korea or Iran or climate change or energy or what have you, but the relationship hasn't gotten there, to be perfectly honest.
Their leader said at the Washington press conference that they had a long way to go in the area of human rights. Do you see any progress there? You have Liu Xiaobo is still in jail. He had the Nobel Prize, was an empty chair. You have the Panchen Lama still in jail. Do you see any chance for a softening of human rights repression in China?
Look, there has been progress over the last couple of decades, but not in the last year or two, where things have gotten tighter, probably in the run-up to the 2012 leadership change. I think in the long run, again, I think things will open up a bit once you get through this leadership transition. At some point, China's got to deal with the gap between its economic dynamism and the lack of a parallel political or equivalent political dynamism. So I think if you're asking me, will China in 10 years be more open than it is today? Yes, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to embrace human rights standards that are to our liking. Doesn't mean it's going to be a linear improvement, but all things being equal, China compared to, say, 20 years ago, at the time of Tiananmen, far more open today than it was. And if you're asking me 10 or 20 years down the road, I would guess it's more open. It's more open still, but it's going to be difficult, and there's going to be steps backwards along the way.
Do you see them as our mortal enemy, as Clapper suggested, or Donald Trump said that they're out to do us in?
No, and if it ever happens, it's a real failure of American and Chinese diplomacy. There's nothing inevitable that the United States and China are going to end up at loggerheads. And if we do, what a distraction. Instead of dealing with the real challenges of the 21st century, we're going to have to end up dealing with one another.
Is the role of the internet in the Mideast revolutions overblown in your judgment? Do you think that it's something that makes the Chinese insecure, that people will be able to connect? Hillary Clinton says the freedom to connect is an essential human right. It's embedded in the Declaration of Human Rights. Is this a shift in U.S. policy?
Look, I know this show is called The Digital Age.
Yes, so we've got to plug the internet.
But I wouldn't exaggerate it. Yes, it had a role in things in Tunisia and Egypt. On the other hand, it's not central to the dynamic in Egypt. It's certainly not central to the dynamic in Libya or what's going on in Saudi Arabia. There's things pushing back against it. Governments have tools that they can use against it, so it's a factor.
Well, we've got to wrap up. So I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
What, in your judgment, is the greatest global threat confronting the United States?
If it's external threats, it's the whole bag of things that come with globalization, from proliferation to terrorism to energy shortages to climate change. If it's internal, it's ourselves and it's our political system and the question about our capacity to organize ourselves sufficiently to essentially put our own house in order so we can act effectively in the world and dealing with these external challenges. So it's this combination of external global challenges, internal political challenges, and I worry about the interplay between the two.
Put our own house in order. Richard Haass, thank you so much for coming by.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age. For the digital age, I'm Jim Zirin. Please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. Please visit Richard Haass's website at www.cfr.org. Thank you very much. Good night and all the best.